Question or participant in the adjournment debate, the honourable member from Saanich, Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm picking up on a question that I asked on World Environment Day. That's June 5th every year, June 5th, 2024. I asked the government and the Prime Minister how they can reconcile claiming to want to protect the endangered southern resident killer whale while so expanding the activities that we know put the survival of that species at risk. The activities I specifically mentioned were the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, now developed, paid for, and owned by the Trans Mountain Corporation, which is a Crown corporation, which means the people of Canada had to spend the $34,000 million to expand a pipeline that had not been approved by the First Nations over whose territory it crossed. I note that earlier today, the Minister of Finance claimed that the First Nations along the route were compliant, but it doesn't meet UNDRIP because it sure wasn't free or prior consent. It was often after the fact that Trans Mountain Corporation, now a Canadian Crown corporation, coerced nations into signing agreements saying, well, you can't stop the pipeline now, so you might as well sign here so we can give you some money. As it's been described by other First Nations, this amounts to economic smallpox, referring to smallpox in blankets in our first wave of colonial settlement on this continent of Turtle Island. I also noted in my question, Mr. Speaker, that the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline has vastly increased the noise of the traffic of tankers as well as the risk of tanker accidents involving dilbit, which can't be cleaned up in a marine environment. In fact, recently Simon Fraser University found that since the pipeline's completion, the increase in tanker traffic is tenfold. That, again, is one of the most severe risks to the survival of the southern resident killer whale. And should a spill occur, or should I say when a spill occurs, the damage is incalculable to all marine species. I also noted in my question that the expansion of the Roberts Bank terminal, the Port of Vancouver, is also a direct threat to the survival of the southern resident killer whale, as well as other species, including the western sandpiper. The response I got from the parliamentary secretary at the time was to mention a number of commitments that I don't think are at all sufficient to the climate crisis, but were not responsive to the fundamental question of how we think we can protect the southern resident killer whale, to which the government is bound to do by the Species at Risk Act, while vastly increasing the threats to that very species. When I asked the question on June 5th, I referenced that there are only 75 whales left in that population. Since then, the number has declined. We now have 73 southern resident killer whales left. I want to again thank the local volunteer groups that work so hard, particularly the Southern Gulf Islands Whale Sighting Network, which keeps a close eye on the number of vessels that are violating the rules, recreational vessels coming too close to the whales, commercial vessels violating the interim protocols that were supposed to be created for sanctuaries in the areas of most critical habitat. In other words, Mr. Speaker, to the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, to the Minister of Environment, everyone in this government, if there is any concern for the survival of this species, the government has to pay attention to reducing the noise, reducing the volume of vessels, and prosecuting those who violate the protocols and the distance requirements to save our whales.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for the Environment and Climate Change.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my friend and colleague from Saanich Gulf Islands for her advocacy for killer whales tonight, and I know that she's been a steadfast champion of mammals that don't vote. It's important to recognize that many aspects of our environment depend on us to be their stewards and their stakeholders, because killer whales are very intelligent animals, but obviously they don't have the right to cast a ballot. But back in 2019, the Government of Canada announced an enhanced recovery strategy for the southern resident killer whale population. Environment and Climate Change Canada and 3 other federal partners took measures to help with the conservation and recovery of this population. This specific group of orcas, the southern resident killer whales, faced a triple threat of pollution, declining numbers of the Chinook salmon that they feed on, and acoustic and physical disturbances from busy shipping lanes and other marine activity. This is not new, but it is undeniably urgent, and that's why our government is taking action throughout an enhanced recovery strategy. This past spring and for the last 6 years, the federal government announced the implementation of new seasonal measures and funding to protect these whales, restore their population, and conserve the health of their food sources. Environment and Climate Change Canada continues to fund and support this chemicals management plan. This is one of several pollution prevention initiatives that have implemented measures and allowed enforcement officials to intervene to protect the killer whales and the environment from harmful pollutants. In addition, new approaches and innovations are changing how we ship goods through the waters, and Canada's marine safety system must also evolve to continue to protect Canadians and the environment. Last summer, the Minister of Transport announced the passage of Bill C-47, which took budget funds and allocated them to specific ocean protection measures, and we created better compensation for communities that would feel the impact in the event of a hazardous substance spill. Canada's Ocean Protection Plan strengthens marine safety within our waters, and we now have vastly faster responses to emergencies, such as marine firefighting and emergency towing. The vessels that travel the Trans Mountain Terminal in British Columbia and Burnaby are monitored and must adhere to strict safety and incident regulations because our government is committed to protecting our waters. Canada targets problem vessels. There is a fund and a protocol in place to remove hazards to navigation and to wildlife, and these measures were created in response to feedback from Indigenous peoples, stakeholders, and Canadians. I imagine some of the whale sighting volunteers that the member from Saanich Gulf Islands mentioned as well. We all agreed the oceans are hurting, and the protection of our oceans is a national priority. It's in everyone's best interest to advance this federal government ocean protection plan. We stand with all Canadians in our love of these BC orcas, the natural environment around us, and we stand behind the protections that we've written into Canadian law. Together, we walk a delicate line between preserving biodiversity and species at risk, tackling climate change, and keeping our economy evolving. And Mr. Speaker, with the remaining time, I'd just like to acknowledge the extraordinary work on this subject that Senator Murray Sinclair did. He was a steadfast advocate for whales and for dolphins and for other marine mammals, particularly when they're being held in captivity for entertainment. We lost Senator Murray Sinclair today, and Canada is a poorer nation without his mind and advocacy. But we are so much richer for his many contributions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Certain that sentiment is generally shared by all members. The honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, thanks to the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for the reference to the late and extraordinary Judge Murray Sinclair, who was the sponsor in the Senate of the bill I took through the House of Commons to ban the keeping of whales in captivity. He'll be deeply missed. In the 45 seconds I have left, Mr. Speaker, let me just say to the Parliamentary Secretary that the Southern Gulf Islands Whale Sighting Network is documenting increasing intrusions and violations that affect the southern resident killer whales. Things are getting much worse, and no matter how many press releases the Liberals issue, it isn't affecting the numbers of southern resident killer whales because we are not enforcing our laws, and with the increased numbers of tankers and the commitment to expand the Roberts Bank terminal, we're going in the opposite direction of what the whales need. And if there ever were a spell, no matter how fast the emergency vessels can get there, all I can imagine is that they stand on the side and weep because we have no technology to clean up a dilbit spill.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And once again, I'd like to thank the member from Saanich Gulf Islands for her extraordinary work on this file, which goes back many, many years, if not more than a decade. As the new Canadian clean energy economy matures and oil and gas pollution measures are made toward Canada's net zero targets, stricter controls on protecting our waters and marine life are absolutely critical. In the event of a spill, there is a faster and better emergency response, and there is better compensation for all types of harvesting impacted between fishing, hunting, gathering of Indigenous traditional medicines. Canada's transforming our economy incrementally. But I'd also like to be optimistic in the hopes that we never have to endure such a horrible event. Oil spills are really, a disgusting event of capitalism and depending on shipping fossil fuels across the ocean. I saw an infographic recently about how far fewer ships would be necessary if we didn't send fossil fuels across the ocean in that regard. But our government is committed to protecting our natural wonders, and I thank the member from the Green Party for her advocacy.
Thank all honourable members for their participation in this adjournment debate. La motion portant que la Chambre s'ajoute